There was a cereal that turned the milk four different colors. Not one, four. Pink, then yellow, then blue, then a soft green that no other breakfast food on earth has ever matched. A color that existed only in the bowl, only on Saturday morning, only when nobody was asking anything of you yet. At its peak in the mid-1970s, that box sat on the shelves of every major supermarket chain in America. Kroger, Safeway, A&P, Winn-Dixie. Millions of children poured it every week without thinking twice. The way you reach for something that has always been there and assume it always will be. The clown on the box smiled back at them. The marshmallows settled into the milk. The morning belonged entirely to the kid holding the spoon. Then one week the shelf was different. No announcement, no farewell, just a gap where the box used to stand, and something else filling the space by the following month. How does a cereal that fed a generation of Saturday mornings simply vanish from American shelves without a single word? This is the story of Kaboom. What it was, who built it, why it mattered, and what was quietly lost the morning it disappeared for good. In the fall of 1967, the cereal wars were the most expensive fight in American grocery. Not a metaphor, a real war, fought in Saturday morning television slots, in supermarket aisle negotiations, in test kitchens where food scientists worked under pressure to produce the next thing that would make a child grab a box off the shelf and refuse to let go. Kellogg's had Tony the Tiger, Post had Sugar Bear, and General Mills, headquartered in Golden Valley, Minnesota, had already won a significant battle 2 years earlier with a product that would define the category for decades. A little green box of oat pieces and marshmallows called Lucky Charms. Lucky Charms had done something the industry hadn't fully expected. It proved that a child would eat a bowl of cereal not just for the cereal, but for what was floating in it. The marshmallows, small, brightly colored, shaped into moons and clovers and stars, transformed breakfast into something closer to a game. The milk changed color. The shapes were different every spoonful. The experience was unpredictable in a way that a bowl of corn flakes simply was not. General Mills knew what they had. They also knew the danger of what they had. If Lucky Charms was the only marshmallow cereal on the market, competitors would eventually copy it. Kellogg's was watching. Post was watching. The safest move was not to protect Lucky Charms alone. It was to occupy more of the same territory first, to launch a second marshmallow cereal before anyone else could, one that served the same Saturday morning child, but felt different enough to justify its own shelf space, its own identity, its own reason to exist. The question was different how? The answer when it came was the circus. It is not entirely clear which individual product developer inside General Mills first proposed the circus concept. The company's internal records from that era are not publicly available, and the brand never received the kind of oral history documentation that larger product launches sometimes generate. What is known is that by 1968, the concept was in development, and by 1969, it was on shelves. The theme was deliberately distinct from Lucky Charms. Where Lucky Charms leaned into Irish folklore and magic, Kaboom leaned into spectacle. The American traveling circus, a world of color and noise and wonder that every child in the country recognized from a very young age. The mascot was a clown. Not a threatening clown, not a complicated clown. A simple, broadly grinning circus performer with a wide smile and bright colors. The kind of face a child associates immediately with excitement and permission. The name printed across the box was onomatopoeic and immediate, Kaboom. One word, no explanation needed. It announced itself the way a cannon fires at the opening of a circus act. The cereal pieces themselves were engineered to match the concept. Unlike the smooth O shapes of Cheerios or the simple puffs of other General Mills products, Kaboom's oat-based pieces were pressed into the shape of smiling clown faces, a technically more demanding form that required specific equipment and consistent production pressure to maintain. Each small piece carried the grinning expression of the mascot, so that even before the marshmallows were added, the bowl itself was part of the show. The marshmallows were where the circus theme ran deepest. General Mills did not simply reuse the shapes from Lucky Charms. Kaboom's marshmallow pieces were designed around the circus world, stars, bears, lions, and elephants. Four shapes, four colors, floating through the oat-based pieces in every bowl. A child eating Kaboom was, in some small and entirely earnest way, eating a circus. The imagery was consistent from the box art to the cereal to the back-of-box games, all of it maintaining the same world. There was one more calculation built into the product from the beginning, one that distinguished Kaboom's positioning from nearly every other sweetened children's cereal of its era. The marketing team made an early decision to lead not just with fun, but with nutrition. The box prominently advertised vitamin fortification. In an era before the full-scale health backlash against children's cereals had arrived, this was a preemptive move, a way of giving the parent who stood in the cereal aisle a reason to say yes to the bright box their child was already reaching for. It was a smart piece of positioning. The child saw the clown and the marshmallows. The parent saw the vitamins. Both of them put the box in the cart. In 1969, Kaboom reached supermarket shelves across the United States. The test kitchen work was done. The circus was open. What happened next would take almost no time at all, because in the American cereal market of the early 1970s, a product that landed right did not gradually find its audience. It exploded into one. Saturday Morning in America, circa 1973, had a specific architecture. It began before anyone else in the house was awake. The child, 6 years old, maybe 7, maybe 8, came downstairs alone, in pajamas, in the quiet that only existed before adults needed anything from anyone. The television was turned on with the particular satisfaction of being the one who got to choose. The volume stayed low because keeping it low was the price of being left alone to watch. And then came the kitchen, the cabinet, the box. The Kaboom box was easy to find. It was red and yellow and loud in the way that only things designed for children are allowed to be loud. Unapologetic about its colors, grinning from the shelf with the clown face that had become, over the course of just a few years, one of the most recognizable images in the American cereal aisle. A child reaching for it knew exactly what was coming. The weight of the box, the sound of the pieces shifting inside, the moment of pouring, that specific clatter of oat-shaped clown faces hitting the bottom of a ceramic bowl, followed by the cold white pour of milk, and then the waiting. The waiting was the ritual, because Kaboom did something that rewarded patience in a way that few other cereals could match. The marshmallows, the stars, the bears, the lions, the elephants, began to bleed their color into the milk almost immediately, not all at once. Gradually, the white turned. Pink came first, usually depending on which marshmallow shapes happened to be nearest the surface, then yellow, then a faint blue. Then, if the child waited long enough and the mix was right, a color that existed nowhere else in the natural world, a soft, indeterminate green that was not quite lime and not quite mint and not quite anything except the specific product of those 4 marshmallow shapes dissolving slowly into cold whole milk on a Saturday morning in 1973. No food scientist designed that color intentionally. It was a consequence of the formula, an accident of the combination, something that happened rather than something that was planned. But it became, for the children who experienced it, one of the most specific sensory memories of their entire childhood. Decades later, adults who had not thought about Kaboom in 30 years could describe that color with a precision they could not apply to things they had seen last week. That is what taste memory does. It stores things with a fidelity that ordinary experience cannot match. The back of the box was its own entertainment system. General Mills designed the Kaboom packaging throughout the 1970s with the same attention to the circus theme that ran through the cereal itself. Mazes, spot the difference puzzles, circus trivia, simple games that a child could work through during breakfast without needing scissors or another person. The box was propped up against the back of the table, angled toward the child, and it held their attention through the entire bowl in a way that was entirely deliberate. Cereal companies understood, by the early 1970s, that the back of the box was real estate. Kaboom used that real estate well. On the television in the next room, Saturday Morning was running its own schedule. ABC and CBS had, by the early 1970s, built Saturday morning into the most concentrated block of children's programming in the history of American television. Super Friends, Scooby-Doo, The Bugs Bunny and Roadrunner Show, Josie and the Pussycats. The lineup changed year to year, but the architecture was the same. Cartoons from 7 in the morning until noon, interrupted at regular intervals by commercials aimed with surgical precision at the child sitting cross-legged on the living room carpet. Kaboom bought time in those slots. The commercials were exactly what the era required. The clown mascot appeared in animated form, presiding over a circus of color and energy, introducing the cereal with the enthusiasm of a ringmaster opening the greatest show on earth. The vitamin message was present but secondary, a line at the end, aimed over the child's head at the adult who might be half listening from another room. What the child heard was the music and the color, and the unmistakable implication that Saturday morning and Kaboom belonged together, that one was incomplete without the other. It was not subliminal. It was not subtle. It was Saturday morning advertising in its purest form, and it worked exactly as designed. Families who watched those commercials bought the box. Children who ate the cereal asked for it again. Parents who needed 30 minutes of quiet on Saturday morning learned that Kaboom was one of the reliable solutions. A box that kept a child occupied at the table without complaint through at least 2 full cartoon segments. The cereal earned its place in the weekly grocery run, not just through advertising, but through functional reliability. It delivered what it promised every time in every bowl. By the mid-1970s, Kaboom had moved beyond being a product that families tried and into something quieter and more durable. It became part of the rhythm of the week. Not a treat, not an occasion, just the box that was always in the cabinet. The clown on the front was as familiar as anything else in the kitchen. Nobody thought about it specifically. Nobody needed to. It was simply there, the way certain things are there in childhood. So constant and so assumed that their presence never registers until one day it is gone. What was it about that clown on the box that made a 7-year-old feel like Saturday morning belonged entirely to them? The answer had nothing to do with the clown. It had to do with the quiet of the house, and the bowl in both hands, and the milk turning colors while the cartoons ran, and nobody needed anything yet. Kaboom was the frame around that experience. Take the frame away, and the experience still existed in memory, but without its edges, without its shape, without the specific weight of the box and the specific sound of the cereal hitting the bowl. For the children of the 1970s who grew up with that Saturday morning, Kaboom was not a breakfast food. It was the first thing they ever chose for themselves. And the trouble, when it came, would start so quietly that almost no one noticed. General Mills did not need to build a distribution network for Kaboom from scratch. That was one of the quiet advantages of being the company that already made Cheerios, Wheaties, and Lucky Charms. By 1969, General Mills had relationships with every major supermarket chain in the United States. The kind of relationships built over decades of reliable product delivery, consistent promotional support, and the simple fact that a grocery buyer who needed to fill a cereal aisle had no real choice but to do business with Minneapolis. The network existed. Kaboom moved through it. Within 2 years of its 1969 launch, Kaboom had national distribution. It appeared on the shelves of Kroger stores in Ohio and Georgia. It sat beside Lucky Charms and Safeway locations from California to Colorado. A&P carried it in the Northeast. Winn-Dixie stocked it across the South. Piggly Wiggly brought it into communities that other national chains had not yet reached. The expansion was not slow or tentative. It was the natural velocity of a product moving through infrastructure that was already built and already running. For a smaller company launching a new cereal in 1969, reaching national distribution might take 5 years of negotiation, failed pitches, and regional test markets. For General Mills, it took the length of a standard grocery contract cycle. This was not luck. It was the compounding advantage of institutional scale. And it was also, quietly, the first reason Kaboom would eventually be vulnerable in ways its creators could not yet see. Inside General Mills, Kaboom entered a portfolio that already included some of the most aggressively marketed cereals in the country. Lucky Charms was growing. Cocoa Puffs, launched in 1958, had the kind of brand recognition that came from a decade of Sonny the Cuckoo Bird commercials. Trix had been on shelves since 1954. These were not just cereals. They were established advertising properties with dedicated budget lines, mascots with recognizable voices, and Saturday morning commercial slots that had been renewed year after year because they reliably moved product. Kaboom was new. New products, inside large portfolios, must prove themselves before they earn equivalent support. In the early 1970s, Kaboom was proving itself well enough to receive genuine marketing investment. The Saturday morning commercial slots were purchased. The clown mascot appeared in animated form across ABC and CBS. The box design was consistent and distinctive. General Mills was, in those first years, treating Kaboom as a real contender, a product with a future in the portfolio, not a test that might be quietly retired. The prize strategy was part of that investment. In the cereal market of the early 1970s, what was inside the box was nearly as important as what was printed on it. Lucky Charms had its marshmallows. But the box prize, the physical object a child could find at the bottom, under the cereal, wrapped in a small plastic sleeve, was a separate category of enticement entirely. General Mills used the Kaboom box to deliver circus-themed premiums that reinforced the brand world. Small toys, activity cards, stickers, games that connected to the imagery on the packaging. A child who opened a box of Kaboom in 1972 and found a miniature circus animal figure at the bottom experienced something that went beyond breakfast. The discovery was the point. The reaching into the box, the finding, the having. These were the mechanics of a loyalty loop that the cereal industry had perfected over 20 years of prize marketing. And Kaboom participated in them fully during its early years of distribution. What no one inside General Mills was discussing openly in those years of expansion and prize investment was the structural tension that came with Kaboom's position in the portfolio. The company was simultaneously selling Lucky Charms and Kaboom, two marshmallow cereals on the same shelves, competing for the same Saturday morning child. The internal logic was that they served different enough niches to coexist. Lucky Charms with its magic and folklore, Kaboom with its circus energy. Grocery buyers accepted both. Parents bought both at different times, for different reasons, or for no particular reason at all beyond which box the child pointed to that week. But portfolio competition has a way of resolving itself over time, and it rarely resolves in favor of the newer product. The supermarket machine that carried Kaboom to national shelves in the early 1970s was the same machine that would eventually determine which products received promotional support, which received prime shelf placement, and which were quietly moved to eye level, and which were shifted toward the bottom shelf where a child's hand could not easily reach. Those decisions were not made by shoppers. They were made in sales meetings and budget reviews by people whose job was to allocate finite resources across a portfolio of more than a dozen competing cereal brands. In 1973, those decisions still favored Kaboom. The sales numbers justified the investment. The Saturday morning slots were running. The prizes were in the boxes. The clown was smiling from the shelf at eye level, right where a 7-year-old walking the cereal aisle with a parent would see it first. The peak was real. The peak was coming. But the peak of a product inside a large corporate portfolio is never purely a function of how good the product is. It is a function of how long the people who control the budget continue to believe in it. And that belief, in the American packaged food industry of the 1970s, was always provisional, always subject to revision, always one bad quarterly review, away from being quietly reallocated to something newer, something shinier, something that had not yet had the chance to disappoint anyone. Kaboom had not disappointed anyone yet. That time was still coming. For now, the boxes were moving. The clown was on every major cereal aisle in the country. And the children who poured it every Saturday morning had no way of knowing that the machine carrying their cereal to the shelf was the same machine that would one day decide to stop. By the mid-1970s, Kaboom had stopped being something families discovered and started being something families simply had. That is a distinction that matters more than it sounds. A product that families discover is a product they are still evaluating, still comparing, still capable of switching. A product that families simply have has crossed a different threshold. It is no longer a choice made consciously at the shelf. It is a reflex. The hand goes to the box because the box has always been there, because the cabinet looks wrong without it, because the child at the breakfast table has never known a Saturday morning that did not include it. That is not brand loyalty in the marketing sense. That is something older and harder to measure. The loyalty of ritual, the loyalty of repetition, the loyalty of a taste that has become inseparable from a specific time of week and a specific age of life. Kaboom reached that threshold sometime around 1974 or 1975, and for the better part of a decade it held it. The household penetration numbers from that era are not precisely documented in any public record, but the distribution footprint tells enough of the story. Kaboom was stocked in the major supermarket chains that collectively served the majority of American households. Kroger, Safeway, A&P, Winn-Dixie, Piggly Wiggly, and the regional chains that filled the spaces between them. A family that did their grocery shopping at any of those stores in any part of the country had access to Kaboom every single week. The box was there when they arrived. It was restocked when it sold. It was a permanent feature of the cereal aisle the way Cheerios was a permanent feature, the way Corn Flakes were a permanent feature. Not because it outsold them, but because it had earned its place and held it without interruption long enough to feel inevitable. In the commercial breaks of Saturday morning television, Kaboom was a constant presence throughout the 1970s. The animated spots featuring the clown mascot ran on ABC and CBS with the regularity of programming rather than advertising. Children encountered them so often that the imagery became ambient, part of the texture of Saturday morning itself rather than an interruption of it. The jingle, the colors, the ringmaster energy of the clown introducing the cereal as though each bowl were the opening act of something spectacular. These were not things children analyzed. They were things children absorbed, the way children absorb everything that repeats itself reliably enough to feel like part of the world. What those commercials did across the better part of a decade was accomplish something that no single advertisement can accomplish on its own. They created a generational handoff. The children who first encountered Kaboom in 1969 and 1970 were, by the late 1970s, approaching adolescence. They were aging out of Saturday morning cartoons, aging out of the cereal aisle's primary demographic, moving toward the concerns and tastes of teenagers. But their younger siblings were still there. And in households where Kaboom had been a staple for 5 or 6 years, the younger children inherited it the way they inherited everything else in the kitchen, not as a discovery, but as a given. The box was already there. The ritual was already established. They simply stepped into it. This is the mechanism by which certain products achieve what the food industry sometimes calls cultural permanence, not through continuous conquest of new customers, but through the reliable reproduction of the same customer. One generation of childhood following another through the same Saturday morning, the same cereal aisle, the same cabinet, the same bowl. Kaboom was doing this quietly and successfully throughout the second half of the 1970s, and the people who worked on the brand during those years understood, even if they could not fully quantify it, that they were maintaining something that had grown larger than a SCO. The factory workers who ran the Kaboom production lines at General Mills during this period were making a product that had become, in the most literal sense, part of the American week. The marshmallow pieces, the stars, the bears, the lions, the elephants, came off the line in the specific colors and sizes that had been standardized early in the product's life and had not changed. The oat-based clown face pieces maintained their shape. The box design evolved slightly across the decade, as packaging always does, but the core identity, the red and yellow, the grinning clown, the circus world, remained consistent enough that a child who had been eating Kaboom since 1971 would have recognized the 1979 box immediately and without hesitation. Consistency was the product as much as the cereal itself. How many bowls of Kaboom were poured in America between 1972 and 1982? And how many of the kids who poured them grew up assuming it would always be there? The number's not calculable, but the assumption was nearly universal among the children who held that box. They were not wrong to make it. Nothing in their experience suggested that the cereal aisle was a temporary arrangement, that the products on it were subject to decisions made in conference rooms far away, that the box they reached for every Saturday morning was maintained on the shelf not by some law of nature, but by a continuous series of business judgments that could at any moment go a different way. They were children. They thought the clown on the box would always be smiling, and for a few more years he was. The shelf held, the boxes moved. The milk turned colors every Saturday morning across the country, in millions of bowls, in millions of kitchens. While the cartoons ran, and the house was quiet and nobody needed anything yet, but something was shifting, not in the bowl, not on the shelf, not anywhere a child could see. It was shifting in the offices and the budget meetings and the market research reports that were beginning, slowly and then less slowly, to point in a direction that nobody who loved Kaboom would have chosen. The first cracks were already forming. They were just very quiet, and the cereal was very good. And for a little while longer, nobody wanted to look. The trouble did not arrive all at once. It never does, with products that people love. The ending of a beloved brand is almost never a single event. It is an accumulation of small decisions, small shifts, small losses that individually seem manageable and collectively prove fatal. The people inside the company often see the individual pieces without seeing the whole picture. The people outside, the shoppers, the children, the parents who have been buying the same box for a decade, see nothing at all until the shelf is empty. For Kaboom, the first crack arrived not from a competitor, but from a conversation that was happening across the entire American food industry in the late 1970s. A conversation about sugar, about children, and about what breakfast was supposed to do. In 1977, the United States Senate Select Committee on Nutrition and Human Needs published a set of dietary guidelines that, for the first time in American federal policy, explicitly connected high sugar consumption to health risk. The document, known informally as the McGovern Report after committee chairman Senator George McGovern of South Dakota, did not single out children's cereal specifically. But the food industry read it carefully, and so did the parent groups, the pediatricians, and the consumer advocacy organizations that had been watching the Saturday morning advertising landscape with increasing concern for several years. By 1978, Action for Children's Television, a Boston-based advocacy organization founded in 1968, had been pressuring the Federal Trade Commission to restrict or ban advertising of sugary products to children on television. The FTC responded in 1978 with a proposed rulemaking that would have significantly curtailed the ability of food companies to advertise sweetened cereals during Saturday morning programming. The proposal was ultimately defeated by 1981 after intense industry lobbying, but the damage to the cultural perception of marshmallow cereals had already been done. The parent who had been putting Kaboom in the cart without thinking twice began, in the late 1970s, to think twice. Not every parent, not immediately, but enough parents in enough households to shift the calculation at the shelf. Lucky Charms faced the same pressure, but Lucky Charms had more marketing budget to push back against it, more brand recognition to absorb the hit, more institutional support inside General Mills to weather the scrutiny. Kaboom had less of all of those things. When the headwind came, it hit the smaller boat harder. The second crack came from inside the box. Throughout the early 1970s, the prize inside the Kaboom box had been a genuine enticement. Small circus-themed toys, activity cards, collectible figures that gave the child at the bottom of the box something to find and keep. By the mid-1970s, the economics of box prizes across the entire cereal industry were under pressure. The cost of manufacturing and inserting physical toys into cereal boxes had risen with inflation. Consumer safety concerns, small parts, choking hazards, were generating new regulatory scrutiny of in-box premiums. And inside General Mills, the budget allocated to Kaboom's promotional program was increasingly measured against the return it generated compared to what the same dollars could do for Lucky Charms or Cocoa Puffs. The prizes got smaller, then simpler. Then they became paper, a punch-out card, a paper game, a sheet of stickers. Then, at some point in the late 1970s, they stopped being a reliable feature of every box at all. A child who reached the bottom of a Kaboom box in 1978 and found nothing there experienced something small and specific and, in the moment, quickly forgotten. But that small disappointment registered somewhere. The box had promised a world, the circus, the clown, the spectacle, and the bottom of the box had always been where that promise was most literally kept. When the promise stopped being kept, the world on the outside of the box became slightly less real. Not enough to stop buying, not yet, but enough to loosen something. The third crack was the quietest and the most consequential. Inside General Mills, the annual budget allocation process for the cereal portfolio was, by the late 1970s, consistently directing the largest shares of marketing investment toward the brands with the highest sales volume and the clearest growth trajectory. Lucky Charms was growing. Cocoa Puffs was stable and heavily supported. Trix had the kind of brand mythology, the rabbit who never got the cereal, that generated earned media and cultural conversation at a fraction of the cost of paid advertising. Kaboom was holding, not growing, not collapsing, holding. In a portfolio management framework, holding is not good enough. A brand that is holding is a brand that is consuming resources without generating momentum. And in the calculus of a large consumer packaged goods company, that is a brand that begins to lose its advocates in the building. The marketing manager who might have pushed for a new Kaboom campaign found better arguments for Lucky Charms. The sales team that might have negotiated harder for Kaboom shelf placement found that their leverage was better spent on products the company was actively promoting. This is how a beloved product begins to die inside a corporation, not with a decision to kill it, but with a series of decisions to invest more fully in something else. No one signs a memo saying Kaboom is finished. They simply stop signing memos that say Kaboom has a future. A mother in suburban Cincinnati noticed something in 1981 that she could not quite name. The Kaboom box seemed smaller than she remembered. Or maybe the price had gone up, or maybe both. There was nothing at the bottom of the box anymore. The commercial she used to see every Saturday morning was not running as often as it had been. Or maybe she was imagining that. She stood in the cereal aisle at Kroger and looked at the shelf and saw Lucky Charms right at eye level, bright and familiar, with a new marshmallow shape on the front of the box and a promotional offer printed in large letters near the top. She put the Lucky Charms in the cart, not because she had decided to stop buying Kaboom, just because Lucky Charms was right there and it was on promotion, and the new marshmallow shape was something her daughter would probably like. She did not think of it as a choice. She thought of it as grocery shopping. How long can a company quietly remove what made something special before the people who loved it stop reaching for it? The answer in Kaboom's case was roughly a decade. And by the early 1980s, that decade was almost up. The decisions that ended Kaboom were not made by people who wanted to destroy it. That is the part of the story that is hardest to hold on to, because it would be simpler if there were a villain, a specific executive who looked at the numbers and said, "This cereal is finished, let's move on." Corporate narratives of beloved brand failures invite that kind of villain, and sometimes the villain exists. But in Kaboom's case, the evidence points to something more ordinary and in some ways more damning than malice. What ended Kaboom was indifference, the slow, structural indifference of a large organization that had stopped believing in something without ever formally deciding to stop. By the early 1980s, General Mills was operating one of the largest and most complex cereal portfolios in the American food industry. The company had more than a dozen active cereal brands competing simultaneously for shelf space, advertising budget, and the internal advocacy of brand managers whose careers were measured by the growth of the products they championed. In that environment, Kaboom's position was precarious in a way that its sales numbers alone did not fully reveal. It was not failing dramatically, it was declining gradually. A few percentage points of market share per year, a slow erosion that was easy to defer addressing because it never triggered an emergency. Gradual decline inside a large corporation is dangerous precisely because it is manageable. An emergency forces a decision. A gradual decline invites delay. The first formally consequential decision came with the formula. At some point in the late 1990s and into the early 2000s, the precise year is not documented in any public source, which is itself revealing. The base cereal in Kaboom shifted from oats to corn. The change was not announced on the packaging. There was no reformulation notice, no new recipe banner, No acknowledgement of any kind that the product in the box was different from the product that had been in the box for 30 years. From General Mills' perspective, the change was a manufacturing and cost decision. Corn-based cereal pieces were less expensive to produce than oat-based pieces. The equipment required was more standardized across the production facility, and the margin improvement was measurable and real. From the perspective of the adults who had been eating Kaboom since childhood and were still occasionally buying it, for themselves, for their own children, for the specific comfort of a taste they had known since they were 7 years old. The change was a betrayal that arrived without warning. The oat base had given Kaboom's clown face pieces a specific texture and a specific flavor that was not interchangeable with corn. Oat-based cereal softens differently in milk. It absorbs liquid more slowly, maintains its structure longer, releases a faint nuttiness into the bowl that corn does not replicate. The color of the milk when oat pieces were present was subtly different from the color when corn pieces were present, even accounting for the marshmallow contribution. These are not differences that show up in a consumer focus group if the question being asked is, does this taste good? They show up when the question is, does this taste like what I remember? And that was the only question that mattered to the people who still cared enough about Kaboom to be buying it in 2001. The online communities that existed by the early 2000s, forums, early food blogs, the nascent nostalgia spaces that would eventually migrate to Reddit and Facebook, began to fill with the specific complaint that Kaboom tasted different, that something had changed, that the cereal they were buying was not the cereal they remembered. General Mills did not respond publicly to these observations. The company had no particular incentive to engage with a conversation about a product that was already being managed toward the end of its commercial life. And that management was the second consequential decision, or rather, the second consequential non-decision. So by the mid-2000s, Kaboom had no meaningful advertising presence. The Saturday morning commercial slots that had defined its identity for a decade had been gone for years. The clown mascot, who had been the face of the brand since 1969, had not appeared in new promotional material in a significant way since the early 1990s. The box design had been updated several times, each update moving slightly further from the bold, circus-specific imagery of the original packaging toward a more generic children's cereal aesthetic that shared visual language with dozens of other products and belonged entirely to none of them. Each redesign erased a little more of what made the box recognizable. A child walking the cereal aisle in 2005 had no particular reason to reach for Kaboom. There was no commercial running that had planted the image in their mind. There was no prize in the box creating a reason to choose it over the cereal next to it. There was no mascot with enough cultural presence to generate the reflexive recognition that Lucky the Leprechaun or Sonny the Cuckoo Bird still commanded. The box was there, but it was effectively invisible, present on the shelf without any of the apparatus that makes a presence on the shelf mean something to a child. The regional sales representatives who were still carrying Kaboom in their portfolio during this period understood what was happening, even if the language of internal corporate communications did not say it plainly. A product without advertising support is a product on borrowed time. The stores that stocked it were stocking it out of inertia. It was still orderable. It still had a slot in the planogram, and as long as it continued to sell at a rate that justified the shelf space, no grocery buyer had a specific reason to remove it. But the rate at which it sold was determined in part by how visible it was, and its visibility was determined in part by promotional support, and the promotional support had gone to zero. The loop closed on itself. Less advertising meant fewer sales. Fewer sales meant less justification for advertising investment. Less advertising investment meant fewer sales. The mathematics of portfolio neglect are circular and self-confirming, and Kaboom was caught fully inside them by the mid-2000s with no one inside General Mills' position to break the cycle. At what point does a company stop making a product and start simply waiting for it to disappear? For Kaboom, the answer appears to be sometime around 2005, 5 years before the official discontinuation, during which period the cereal continued to be manufactured and distributed in diminishing quantities to a shrinking number of retail locations, sustained not by any active business decision, but by the absence of a decision to end it. It existed in a kind of corporate limbo, not supported enough to grow, not failed enough to be formally discontinued, drifting toward an ending that everyone with access to the numbers could see and that no one was moved to prevent. And what does it mean for the people who made it? The workers, the food scientists, the sales representatives who had carried the brand through its best years and its worst, when a product they built is allowed to disappear this way. The workers on the General Mills production lines did not receive a dramatic notification. The Kaboom runs became less frequent. The equipment that formed the clown face oat pieces, and later the corn pieces, ran fewer hours per month, then fewer hours per quarter, then was repurposed or retooled for other products in the portfolio that had more active support. There was no last day of production that anyone marked. There was no ceremony for a cereal that had been made continuously for more than 40 years. There was just, at some point, a run that turned out to be the last one. The boxes from that final production run moved through the distribution system in the ordinary way, loaded onto trucks, delivered to warehouses, shipped to stores, placed on shelves. The people who stocked them did not know they were stocking the last Kaboom that would ever exist. The people who bought them did not know they were buying the last boxes. The children who poured them on Saturday mornings in 2009 and early 2010 did not know that the color the milk was turning was a color that would never be made again. That is how it ended, not with an announcement, not with a press release, not with anything that acknowledged that something real and specific and irreplaceable was being lost. Just with a shelf that, one week, did not get restocked. The first sign was not a notice on the General Mills website, it was a gap on the shelf. Sometime in 2010, in supermarkets across the country, the space where Kaboom had always stood began to stay empty longer than it should have. Not dramatically empty, not the kind of gap that makes a store manager call the distributor immediately. Just slightly, persistently empty in a way that was easy to overlook if you were not specifically looking for Kaboom. If you were shopping for cereal in general, your eye moved to the boxes that were there. If you were shopping specifically for Kaboom, if you were one of the people for whom the box was still a reflex, still the thing the hand went to without thinking, you noticed. At first, the reasonable assumption was a supply issue, temporary stock out. The truck was late, the warehouse was low. These things happened with cereal, with everything, and they resolved themselves within a week or two when the next shipment arrived. The parents and the occasional adult who had never stopped buying Kaboom made a mental note and reached for something else that week, expecting to find the familiar box back in its place on the next grocery run. It was not back in its place. In households across the country, the realization arrived at different times and through different routes. Some people noticed the shelf gap and waited. Some people asked a store employee who checked the system and reported that the item was not on the current order. Some people went to a second store, found the same absence, and began to understand that this was not a supply problem. And some people, the ones who had grown up with Kaboom and felt something specific and not entirely rational at the prospect of its absence, went home and typed the words into a search engine. What they found in early 2010 was the beginning of a collective recognition. The online spaces where American food nostalgia had been gathering for years, the early Facebook groups, the food forums, the nascent communities on what would become Reddit's nostalgia and cereal-focused threads, began to fill with the same question arriving from different directions. Is Kaboom discontinued? Has anyone seen Kaboom at their store? Does anyone know what happened to Kaboom? The questions were asked with the specific anxiety of people who had not expected to feel this way about a breakfast cereal and were surprised to discover that they did. General Mills did not issue a formal discontinuation announcement for Kaboom in the way that some companies mark the end of a product. With a press release, a final limited run, a social media farewell that acknowledges the product's history and thanks the people who loved it. The company's public communication about Kaboom's end was, consistent with the brand's final years of neglect, essentially non-existent. A General Mills customer service line confirmed discontinuation to callers who asked directly. The company's website eventually reflected the product's absence, but there was no statement, no acknowledgement of what was being lost, no gesture toward the 41 years of Saturday mornings that Kaboom had been part of. The silence was its own kind of answer. On eBay, within weeks of the shelf gaps becoming widespread, listings for Kaboom appeared. New old stock, boxes that had been sitting in back rooms, in warehouse corners, in the pantries of people who bought in bulk, began to surface and immediately attracted bidders. A box of Kaboom that had retailed for less than $4 was selling for $15, $20, $25 to people who needed to have one more, or one last, or one to put on a shelf and look at. The prices were not rational in any grocery store sense. They were entirely rational in the sense that grief has its own economy, and the people bidding on those boxes were not buying cereal. They were buying time. The Facebook groups arrived quickly. Bring back Kaboom pages accumulated members in the hundreds, then the thousands. People who shared photographs of the box, who posted memories of Saturday mornings, who tagged siblings and childhood friends and said, "Do you remember this? Do you remember what the milk looked like? Do you remember the clown?" The comments on those posts ran long and specific in the way that food memory always runs specific. Not, "I remember that cereal," but "I remember pouring it at my grandmother's house on the brown table by the window. And I remember the year my mom switched us to Lucky Charms and I cried. And I remember the last box we had and not knowing it was the last one." That last detail, not knowing it was the last one, appeared again and again in those early online conversations, with a consistency that suggested it was not incidental. It was the specific wound, not the loss itself, but the loss without warning, the absence of a goodbye. A woman in suburban Atlanta described, in a Facebook comment that was shared several hundred times, the moment she reached for Kaboom at her local Publix in the spring of 2010 and found the space empty. She had been buying Kaboom for her son for 3 years. Not every week, but often, the way you buy something that has become part of the rhythm without becoming a formal tradition. She asked the stock clerk, who checked a handheld device and told her the item had been discontinued. She stood in the cereal aisle for a moment that she described as disproportionate to the situation. Then she took a photograph of the empty shelf space with her phone. She could not fully explain why she took the photograph. She posted it to the Facebook group later that week with a caption that read simply, "This is where it used to be." The photograph showed a gap between two other cereal boxes, bright, fully stocked, indifferent to the space between them. The gap was approximately the width of a Kaboom box. Within a few days, the store would fill it with something else, and the evidence that Kaboom had ever occupied that particular few inches of American shelf space would be gone entirely. In the supermarket stock rooms and distribution centers that had been handling Kaboom for decades, the practical end of the product was even quieter. The last shipments had moved through the system without distinction. Cases of cereal loaded and delivered and shelved like any other product on any other week. The drivers who made those deliveries did not know they were delivering the last of something. The warehouse workers who picked the cases did not know. The store employees who broke down the boxes and placed the individual units on the shelf did not know. The machinery of American grocery distribution is designed for continuous forward motion. It does not pause to mark endings. It does not have a mechanism for acknowledging that something is over. It simply stops receiving orders for a particular item, and that item stops appearing on trucks, and the space on the shelf gets reallocated, and the planogram is updated to reflect what is actually available, and the cereal aisle continues to exist without whatever it used to contain. Somewhere, in early 2010, a child poured what turned out to be the last bowl of Kaboom that would ever be poured from a freshly opened box. The milk began to turn colors, pink, then yellow, then the faint blue, then that particular green that existed nowhere else. The child ate the cereal and watched the Saturday morning cartoons and went on with the morning without knowing that the color in the bowl was a color the world was about to lose. How many things that shaped a childhood disappear this way? Not with a funeral, but with a shelf that simply stops being refilled. The answer is most of them, almost all of them. The products that define the specific texture of a generation's early life rarely receive the acknowledgement their absence deserves. They end the way Kaboom ended, in the gap between two other boxes, in the question asked of a stock clerk, in the photograph of empty shelf space that a woman in Atlanta could not stop herself from taking because something in her understood, even if she could not say it plainly, that a record needed to exist. Kaboom was gone. 41 years of Saturday mornings, of milk turning four colors, of the clowns smiling from the shelf at the eye level of every child who walked the cereal aisle with a parent. Gone without ceremony, without acknowledgement, without a single word from the company that had made it and unmade it. The shelf was filled by the following week. Something else stood where the clown used to smile. The morning continued, it always does. The space on the shelf did not stay empty for long. It never does. The cereal aisle is a zero-sum arrangement. Every inch of shelf space is spoken for, and when one product leaves, another moves in to fill the gap with the efficiency of water finding level. In the months following Kaboom's discontinuation in 2010, the shelf space it had occupied in stores across the country was absorbed by the brands that had been waiting for it. Lucky Charms expanded. Cocoa Puffs took additional facings, newer entries in the children's cereal segment, cereals built around licensed characters, around movie franchises, around the particular kind of brand recognition that came from a child seeing something on a screen and demanding to eat it for breakfast, filled in the remaining space without difficulty. The market did not mourn. Markets do not mourn, they reallocate. But the people who had loved Kaboom were not a market. They were a community, and in 2010, that community had, for the first time in its history, the tools to find itself. The Facebook groups that formed in the weeks and months after Kaboom's discontinuation were not organized campaigns with leadership structures and strategic goals. They were something more spontaneous and more human than that. Collections of people who had independently experienced the same loss and discovered, through the particular mechanics of early social media, that they were not alone in experiencing it. The groups grew by the mechanism that all such groups grow. One person posted, tagged a sibling or a childhood friend, and that friend recognized the reference and shared it further, and the circle expanded outward through the specific geography of shared American childhood. What the members of those groups posted was not primarily petitions or demands, though some of that existed. What they posted overwhelmingly was memory. The Saturday morning rituals came first, the specific details that only someone who had actually eaten Kaboom could know. The color sequence of the milk, the texture of the oat pieces before the formula change, the weight of the box, the sound it made when it was nearly empty and you shook it to assess how much was left, the back-of-box games, the prizes that used to be at the bottom and then weren't, the clown's face described with an affection that would have seemed disproportionate if the subject had been anything other than a childhood breakfast cereal, and was, given what the subject actually was, entirely proportionate. The food blogs and early nostalgia websites that covered Kaboom's discontinuation in 2010 and 2011 noted a consistent pattern in reader responses. The people commenting were not primarily asking for the cereal back, though they would have welcomed its return. They were primarily asking to be heard, to have the specific reality of what they had lost acknowledged by someone, anyone outside their own memory. The Kaboom community was performing, in the comment sections of food websites and the walls of Facebook groups, the same function that any memorial performs. It was making the loss real by making it shared. General Mills received the petitions. The company's customer service communications acknowledged the discontinuation with the standard language of corporate condolence. Thank you for your loyalty to our brand. We appreciate your feedback. We will pass your comments along to the appropriate team. No commitment to revival. No acknowledgement of what the product had meant to the people writing in. The language was designed to close the conversation, and in the formal sense it did. In the informal sense, the conversation did not close. It moved to Reddit. By the mid-2010s, the subreddits dedicated to nostalgia and to vintage cereals had become the primary archive of Kaboom memory. Threads appeared regularly, someone posting a photograph of an old box found in a relative's basement, someone asking if anyone else remembered the specific green the milk turned, someone describing an attempt to recreate the cereal at home using commercially available marshmallows and oat-based cereal pieces. The recreation attempts were numerous and almost uniformly unsuccessful, which generated their own kind of documentation. The specific combination of ingredients, the specific manufacturing process, the specific marshmallow formula that General Mills had developed and refined over 4 decades. These were not things that could be approximated in a home kitchen. The taste memory was precise enough that approximations were immediately identifiable as approximations. This was, in its own way, a form of tribute. The fact that Kaboom could not be meaningfully replicated was evidence of how specific it had been, evidence that it had possessed a particular identity that was not reducible to its component parts. A cereal that could be easily recreated at home with off-the-shelf ingredients would not have generated the decade-long effort to do so. The effort itself testified to the irreplaceability of what had been lost. The vintage box collector market told a similar story. By the mid-2010s, sealed Kaboom boxes from the 1970s and early 1980s were appearing on eBay and Etsy at prices that reflected not their material value, but their value as artifacts of a specific American childhood. A sealed box from 1975 with the original prize still inside could command prices that would have seemed absurd measured against the original retail price of under $1. Collectors who specialized in vintage cereal packaging treated Kaboom boxes with the same care they applied to other irreplaceable objects, storing them in climate-controlled conditions, documenting their provenance, photographing them for online communities that understood immediately what they were looking at. The broader food industry took from Kaboom's story a lesson that it applied inconsistently and often too late. The discontinuation of a product with genuine emotional equity, a product that had been part of the lived experience of millions of people during their formative years, generated a kind of brand damage that did not appear on any balance sheet but was real nonetheless. The people who felt abandoned by Kaboom's disappearance were not a large enough group to threaten General Mills' overall business, but they were a visible group, and their visibility in online spaces meant that the story of how Kaboom had been neglected and then quietly ended circulated in the same communities where General Mills was trying to build enthusiasm for its current portfolio. The lesson, stated plainly, was this: the way a company ends a beloved product is part of its relationship with the people who loved it. A product discontinued with transparency, with acknowledgement, with some gesture toward the meaning it carried, even a simple statement that recognized what it had been, generates a different response than a product that disappears without a word. General Mills chose silence. The communities that formed around Kaboom's memory chose, in response, to tell the story themselves. What does American food culture lose each time a flavor disappears? Not just a product, but a specific morning, a specific kitchen, a specific version of childhood that can never be reconstructed? The loss is not quantifiable in the way that market share is quantifiable or revenue is quantifiable. It is a loss of texture, of the specific sensory details that make a period of life feel real in memory, rather than abstract. The adults who grew up with Kaboom do not remember the 1970s in general. They remember specific mornings, specific bowls, specific colors in specific kitchens. Those memories are anchored to objects, and when the objects disappear, the anchors hold. But they hold to something that no longer exists in the world, only in the mind. That is what was lost when Kaboom left the shelf. Not a cereal, a set of anchors. There was a morning. Call it 1976, call it 1978, call it whatever year sits at the center of your own memory of it, when a child came downstairs before anyone else was awake. The house was quiet in the specific way that houses are quiet before the adults in them have needs. The television came on with the low volume that was the price of being left alone to watch it. The kitchen was cold, the way kitchens are cold in the early morning, and the cabinet opened, and the box was there. Red and yellow and loud and entirely familiar. The clown grinning from the front with the uncomplicated enthusiasm of something that had never been asked to be more than it was. The cereal hit the bowl with the sound that only that cereal made. The milk went in cold, straight from the refrigerator, and then the waiting began. The specific, unhurried waiting of a child with nowhere to be, with nothing required of them yet, with the whole architecture of Saturday morning still intact and undemanding. The marshmallows began to move. The colors began to appear at the edges of the milk, slowly, the way light changes rather than the way a switch flips. Pink first, usually, then yellow. then a blue that was not quite any blue that existed anywhere else. Then if the bowl was full enough and the morning was unhurried enough, that green, that particular, unrepeatable green that was the product of those four specific marshmallow shapes dissolving into cold whole milk in a ceramic bowl on a Saturday morning in America in the 1970s. The child ate the cereal and watched the cartoons, and the morning belonged entirely to them. No one was asking anything yet. The day had not started in the way that days start when other people are awake and the world has requirements. It was just the bowl and the television and the colors and the quiet. That morning happened millions of times in millions of kitchens across a decade and more of American life. It happened in ranch houses in Ohio and row houses in Baltimore and apartments in Chicago and split levels in suburban California. It happened to children whose families had very little and to children whose families had more, because Kaboom cost under $1 and the Saturday morning it enabled cost nothing at all. It was a working-class breakfast in the most dignified sense of that phrase. Inexpensive, reliable, beloved, made by people in a factory in Minnesota for people in kitchens across the country who needed something that would feed a child and give a parent 30 minutes of quiet and ask nothing complicated of anyone. What Kaboom provided was not nutrition, though it provided that too. It was not entertainment, though the box delivered that as well. What Kaboom provided, in the specific combination of its formula and its packaging and its Saturday morning context, was permission. Permission for a child to have something that was entirely theirs. A taste, a ritual, a private version of the morning that existed before the day made its demands. The circus on the box was not incidental to this. The circus is the world where ordinary rules are suspended, where color and spectacle replace the gray requirements of regular life, where a child can watch something extraordinary without being asked to participate or perform or achieve. The clown on the front of the Kaboom box was an invitation into that world, extended every week for $1 or less to any child whose parent put it in the grocery cart. No focus group designed that meaning. No brand strategist wrote it into a creative brief. It accumulated over years and decades of repetition in the specific way that ritual accumulates meaning. Not through intention, but through consistency, through the reliable return of the same experience in the same context at the same time each week. The meaning was made by the children who poured the cereal, and by the parents who bought it, and by the factory workers who made it possible, and by the food scientists who developed the formula in 1969, and by the box designers who maintained the circus world across 4 decades of packaging updates. It was a collective creation, and its loss was a collective loss, even if most of the people who experienced the loss did not have language for it at the time. They knew only that they reached for the box and the box was not there, and that the absence felt larger than the object that had left. The people who made Kaboom, who ran the production lines and drove the distribution routes, and sat in the test kitchen in 1968 and said, yes, this is it. This is what people want, did not receive acknowledgement when it ended. The factory workers whose hands had touched the equipment that formed millions of clown-faced cereal pieces over 41 years went on to other products on other lines without ceremony. The food scientists who had maintained and adjusted the formula across decades moved to other projects. The sales representatives who had carried the brand through its best years and its diminished final decade retired or transferred without a formal recognition of what they had spent years delivering to American shelves. They deserved better than that. So did the parents who bought it every week without thinking about it, the way you care for something you love without accounting for the care. So did the children who poured it and watched the milk change colors and felt in that specific unhurried morning that the world was arranged correctly. Somewhere tonight, someone is telling their grandchild about a cereal with a clown on the box and marshmallows that turn the milk 4 different colors. The grandchild has never seen it, but they understand from the way it is described, from the particular quality of attention the description receives, from the way the voice slows down around the colors and the Saturday morning and the quiet house, that what is being described is not really a cereal at all. It is a morning that lasted for a decade and then ended without warning. It is a kitchen that no longer exists in any house, only in the memory of the person who stood in it. It is a taste that was specific and real and unrepeatable, made by people who believed it was worth making, eaten by children who had no idea they were living inside something they would spend the rest of their lives trying to describe. Nobody makes that anymore either.